What is really going on here? You're never going to find out from the media. They're a part of the problem.
Fix the Media, an independent media solidarity production, with your host, Peter Klein.
Welcome, everyone, to Fix the Media. This show is a sub-project of the greater Fix the Media project, conceived of by Independent Media Solidarity, or IMS. IMS is an independent journalist collective made up of people just like you, who want only to understand their world and share what they find. My name is Peter Klein, and I am merely the host of the show. But this show is merely a channel of communication used by IMS for sharing news and coordinating events relating to the Fix the Media project as it unfolds. Currently, the show is used mostly to build up the justification for fixing the media. It's also being used to generate interest and promote the IMS group and the Fix the Media project. So with that, I want to thank you for tuning in and assure you that this show may be the best yet. We'll have to see. During this show, I'm going to explain 9/11 from a perspective rarely shared or discussed by the notable 9/11 truthers or the truth community in general. Viewing it from this perspective reveals a lot more than you'd get were 9/11 a standalone crime, which almost all theories have it. It means there was no esoteric or symbolic nature to 9/11. That part alone will cause many people to roll their eyes or become angry, since so many people love to ascribe godlike powers to the establishment. Viewing 9/11 from this perspective also means accepting that at its root, the events had nothing to do with the Middle East or oil. That isn't to say it hasn't led to events involving the Middle East or oil, just that its purpose had nothing to do with those subjects. This too will discourage some listeners, since many of us are very opposed to the war on terror, as am I, which is often justified by citing 9/11. So we're going to devote the entirety of this show to understanding this unique perspective of 9/11. As I've said before, 9/11 does not appear to have been a crime in and of itself, but was simply a cover-up crime. Does this notion intrigue you? Do you have the slightest inkling what I'm getting at? Even if you do, stay tuned, as I'm going to make an effort to address some heretofore unreported aspects of the story, as well as make some unique observations. And just like that, we have left the dock and are now underway. This is a diversion from the Fix the Media project in some ways. But the more I thought about it, the more I remembered how much the media was a factor in the 9/11 events. And if anything, the present-day media appears to have one highest priority: concealing the true history of the world, which was the primary topic of our last show. One way in which they do that is to tell and promote blatant lies. Much of what the media reports about 9/11 are blatant lies. Another way in which they conceal our true history is by ignoring certain topics that would potentially lead us to the truth about our history. The media's total silence about the recent uncovering of evidence of a DC pedophile ring is just one example. Another way is to inundate their audience with useless and meaningless junk news. One of their favorite junk news topics is politics. The president may hold a news conference in which he encourages less partisan bickering, and the media will imply that it warrants our attention and that it's important national news. Or they latch on to scandals like Wienergate, where an insignificant politician was caught texting photos of his crotch. His clothed crotch, mind you, not his actual genitalia. These and other nonsense events are used as time fillers, time that could otherwise be spent reporting important news that really did matter. In some ways, the media is caught between a rock and a hard place. Doing what they do now is leading inevitably to their demise, as more and more people are becoming wise to their shenanigans. But to begin reporting truthfully would involve a lengthy process of reconciliation and correction of past reporting. It would be impossible for them to begin with a clean slate, as even their reporting of only a week earlier would conflict with their reporting going forward. I'm not saying I have empathy for them, but that I understand their conundrum to some degree. I think the proper thing to do is to stop all of the propaganda and fear-mongering and begin reporting the truth. That's my position. Now, early on in this analysis, it's worth noting that most people are simply oblivious to the true nature of the 9/11 events or any of the related subjects. Most people never took the time to investigate the subjects for themselves. That's the bottom line. So we can expect their understanding to be largely comprised of media talking points mixed with a few outlying ideas like 9/11 was an inside job. They will mostly view this storyline as the media has portrayed it, even if they don't entirely trust the media. They haven't exposed themselves to anything that would challenge it. A good percentage of people, on the other hand, will have read an article or two that challenges the official account or seen a documentary like Loose Change that similarly refutes the official storyline. But as in the case with any complicated topic, there are certain elements of the story or the conspiracy theories that will interest people more than others. I've noticed that one massive magnet for the public's interest is the destruction of the World Trade Center towers and how that was accomplished. I'm not sure of the reason, but that element of the story seems to be of more interest than just about any other. So it stands to reason that if you get caught up in pondering or investigating or debating one element of the story, that's likely to hinder your time spent looking into other aspects of the story. I'm assuming that you, listening now to this show, are familiar with the official account of events for the most part. At least you've been exposed to the who and the what of the storyline, the hijackers, etc. One thing I know you haven't been exposed to, though, is the motive for the attacks. No official motive for the attacks was ever reported. That might interest you. It interests me. But there being no motive might lead you to one or more theories that involve an inside job of some kind, and most alternative theories of 9/11 suggest that elements within the U.S. power structure were responsible. So then the question comes back to motive. This time the question isn't, why did those foreigners attack America, but rather, why did forces inside America attack America? The almost automatic response to that question is either to justify foreign excursions and acquire foreign oil, or to establish the justification for a planned police state or surveillance state. And I'm aware that the foreign excursions and oil response is another way of saying to line the pockets of the defense contractors and certain politicians. The problem here is that no matter the true motive for 9/11, the U.S. establishment has demonstrated this trend toward foreign affairs and forming a police state for decades before 9/11. Learning this particular perspective on 9/11 will involve viewing the entire affair with new eyes. It will involve looking at things that rarely get looked at or get glossed over too quickly. It also involves refusing to accept this absence of motive. But most importantly, it involves looking for a pattern. And there was a distinct pattern to the events that occurred on that day that few have noticed or identified. In some ways, what may get you looking in the right direction to identify the perpetrators might begin when you see this pattern. If you were involved in perpetrating something as vile and terrible an act as what happened on 9/11, would you be any less concerned about being found out than any other murderer? Would you be concerned that someone might examine the evidence and uncover a pattern that would link you to the crime? Of course you would. Therefore, In this case, it's safe to say that the perpetrators love most of the 9/11 truth community. They are so far off track, the perps don't even have to pay close attention to their activities. Only people who have shown awareness of the pattern concern them in the slightest, and those are so few in number that it's hard to gauge just how concerned they are. And awareness of the pattern can also lead you to conclude what might have gone wrong on 9/11. For instance, the official story has it that a fourth plane was also hijacked but went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, Flight 93. Using the pattern as a guide can easily lead you to conclude that Flight 93 was actually intended to crash into World Trade Center Building Number 7. The massive commission report on 9/11 doesn't make any mention of Building 7, despite its total destruction. And looking at it from this perspective, that makes perfect sense. It wasn't part of the planned cover story for the plane to go down in Pennsylvania. Oh, and that music means that it's time to thank God for forgiving us for being an idiot at times. And before we continue, it's a good time for a head change. Alright, did that change your head? Good. If it didn't, then I'm at a loss. If the pleadings of a young girl can't get through to you, I don't know what will. So I guess it's time to drop the bomb that I've been holding on to thus far. The motive for the 9/11 attacks. As I said, they were attacks intended to cover up prior crimes, so those crimes must have been pretty damn severe to justify a cover-up job the likes of 9/11. Well, imagine if you were the President of the United States or the Director of the CIA, and you had not only sexually abused young children, but also tortured and killed them. If somehow perpetrating a 9/11-like scenario would protect you from being prosecuted for those crimes and possibly being put to death, would you do it? Of course, you have to think like a child-torturing psychopath to truly understand that question and answer it, which most of us simply can't do. But you can see how 9/11 could have been no sweat off the backs of the perpetrators. The crimes that eventually led to perpetrating the 9/11 attacks begin at least as early as World War II. But don't worry, I'm not going to drift off into a boring history lesson. I'm going to focus on the obvious key points, so I'm sure you'll understand what I'm talking about and probably find it very interesting. Few people know that with the Allied victory in World War II came an unprecedented appropriation of all the intellectual property and physical assets of the German nation and the Japanese Empire. In fact, I suspect that many of the wondrous advances in technology and other areas we've experienced in the West since World War II are simply stuff we stole from Germany, especially after World War II. You've probably heard of Nazi gold and how it was a contentious issue for a while and eventually led to some of it being returned to its supposed rightful owners. I have strong doubts that is what actually happened. But our concern relative to this analysis is the Japanese gold that was confiscated after World War II. You never hear about that because under international law it should have been returned to Japan after the war, and for whatever reason it wasn't. How much gold are we talking about here? Well, the estimates range from 70,000 tons to 230,000 tons. And just for reference, all the gold mined worldwide in a year these days is usually less than 2,000 tons. So it was an outrageous amount of gold. In underground circles, the gold became known as the Golden Lily treasure. What may come as additional bad news to some listening is that everybody knew about this gold heist. In other words, most of the leadership of the world in most countries knew about it, and many eventually became involved in a sense. Now, prior to and throughout the war, there was a U.S. submarine blockade preventing ships from freely traveling to and from the island nation of Japan. So Japan was forced to find somewhere else to store its booty and resorted to hiding it in various underground vaults in the Philippines. If you're now wondering whether any of those shenanigans involving Ferdinand Marcos back in the 80s had anything to do with this, oh, you bet it did. Once again, here we are talking about significant historical events, and yet the true nature of those events have nothing to do with the historical accounts. Now that's as far back as I'm going to go in this analysis, and most of the other information I'm going to share is about events in the more recent past. But for the moment, let's stay in the immediate post-World War II period to make sure we understand the significance of this gold appropriation and what it led to. Some of this information is known, and some is just speculation, but very simple, common sense speculation based on a solid understanding of related matters. So nothing I'm sharing with you here is left field claptrap. The OSS and CIA were big players in the seizing of and handling of this massive and top secret treasure, but as has been the case for thousands of years, it was necessary to involve the banks in the overall operation. I should mention that there's plenty of evidence that financial crimes were being committed with the full knowledge of the highest level of government officials and bank executives before World War II and the events we're talking about here. For example, the Federal Reserve Bank appears to have issued bonds in exchange for gold and other commodities in amounts that are unthinkable to most these days. For instance, there are photos of one particular bond chest that looks to be from the 1930s to 1940s time period, and the brass or bronze cladding is engraved or stamped with Federal Reserve Bank. It's actually stamped Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Texas, Series 1934. It also denotes that it's a master control box, includes a security code and serial number, and get this, identifies the face value of the bonds within at $3 trillion US American. Okay? Now, you may have heard stories in the news of horrible criminals being caught with fake U.S. bonds or certificates with outrageous face values like $32 billion or even more. These reports are extremely rare, as most of the time these arrests or detainments go unreported. Most every news report has included the detail that the notes are forgeries. One even went as far as claiming they were generated using a common inkjet printer. In my opinion, these reporting agencies would have been better off just not reporting the story at all, because these bonds and certificates were almost certainly real. Just common sense would tell you that they were real because of the incredible values. Assuming the people found possessing them intended to utilize them as financial instruments or even to cash them out for U.S. currency, it's hard to imagine any banking officials falling for some scam like it was passing a bad check or something. So the instruments were real, which leads to the question, how in the hell are people in possession of such high-value U.S. bonds or certificates? Well, as you can probably imagine, but not yet considered, it appears that the U.S. or agencies within the U.S., like the CIA, has been, on occasion, giving out certificates worth trillions of dollars, but never intending to redeem them in the future. In some of these control boxes, there are ledgers that include redemption coupons with dates spread out like lottery disbursements. Some show that, after a long period of 20 or even 30 years, a couple disbursements were made, but the remaining coupons show no further activity. This is very reminiscent of a story few people know about that occurred as recently as a few years ago involving high-value banknotes and China. It was a sting operation, actually, whereby people from the dragon families in China, and I won't go into what that's about, look it up, dragon family, or families, in China, and certain U.S. citizens conceived of a way to catch the U.S. establishment in the act of refusing to redeem high-value banknotes they had earlier issued. In this case, the possessors had hundreds of notes, each worth $1 billion. What they did was to contact the Federal Reserve and express that they were intent on redeeming the notes. And there's absolutely nothing illegal or remotely shady about wanting to cash in these valuable notes, so long as the redeeming party has the proper authority to do so. The feds referred the Chinese to the Secret Service, I believe, and pardon me if I get some parts of the story mixed up. I'm going by memory, and it's been quite a while since I've reviewed my notes on this. The Secret Service, who I believe are responsible for validating U.S. currency, including these high-value notes, did some over-the-phone verification and identification processes. Then they, too, referred them to another party, this time the Department of Homeland Security. So the Chinese set up a meeting with the DHS at their offices in D.C. They only identified an interest in redeeming, I think, 2 or 3 notes worth 2 or 3 billion US dollars. So they met at the arranged time and had a brief conversation where the DHS explained the verification process. They said it would take a few days to complete verification to allow the redemption to go forward, and said they needed to take possession of the bonds for the time being as part of verification. I don't recall whether the Chinese were given any kind of receipt, but they may have been. But they were told to expect a call within a few days and departed. Can you guess where this story is going to end up? Come on now. Think about it. Exactly. After a week, they called and could only leave a message that they were following up. But after almost 2 weeks, they were able to speak to one of the DHS officials they met with, who replied, "What bonds?" You get it? They never had any intention of paying. Now, on the upside, the Chinese and U.S. persons involved in the sting were expecting that kind of treatment and considered that part of the operation a success. What they did from there, I don't know. I suspect they then compiled that evidence with what they already had and began work on an international lawsuit of some kind, which may still not have been filed. But hopefully this backstory, some of which is unrelated to 9/11, gives you a better understanding of the level of corruption we're dealing with here. With this background, you might be able already to imagine how someone might have perpetrated 9/11 as a means to cover up financial crimes of this magnitude. But now let's get back to where we left off with the Golden Lily treasure, now in the possession of the U.S. Very soon after taking possession of this huge treasure in gold, with the aid of the corrupt banking establishment, a fund was set up called the Black Eagle Trust. One thing I found in researching this and other related topics is that many officials in military and intelligence capacities in the U.S. and other countries also have very direct connections to banks. Not always big notable banks, sometimes banks with unfamiliar names, but banks nonetheless. Oftentimes these government officials are the proprietors of these banks or high-ranking bank officials, even sometimes simultaneous with their government role. That was the case with the group most responsible for the Black Eagle Trust and what became of it. We know Bill Donovan was involved, as he headed the OSS at the time. Other important figures involved, and some names you might recognize, were William Casey, Alan Dulles, Paul Hellawell, Earl Koch, the Morgan brothers of Morgan Stanley fame, and the Keswick brothers, who headed the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Now, watch as each name can be converted into a corresponding bank in one step through a direct role or relationship. William Casey connects to Export-Import Bank. Alan Dulles connects to Bank of New York, a very corrupt bank central to the crimes even to this day. Paul Hellawell connects to Castle Bank, Mercantile Bank, Nugan Hand International Bank, and Household Bank. The Morgan brothers connect to Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Chase Manhattan. And the Keswick brothers connect to HSBC Bank. Now, how all of this gold was converted into currency or otherwise was used to fund various operations and enrich certain people involves the banks and various means of securitization. Lots of people have leaked information over the years that indicate how this was done by showing that accounts have existed at a number of well-known banks containing large sums of money, but it was direct testimony through the deposition of one of the key players, Earl Koch, that connected these accounts to the Black Eagle Trust. You probably don't know how banks conduct business, and it's a very complex maze of processes, some of which are proprietary. You might have heard of SWIFT, for example, but not know what its function is. One important aspect of the banking system to understand for this analysis is that all banks maintain a book or ledger. This book is obviously a digital construct in this day and age, but it's very similar to the ledgers kept before the age of computing. But in the modern era, the book kept by banks is a total record of what are called green screen transactions. Green screen transactions involve activities you'd expect and take place during what is known as banking hours or during the day. But as you might have come to expect, all of the banks we're discussing here run two books. The second book includes all of the shady or outright criminal transactions and figures the bank engages in for various purposes. Sometimes the off-the-book or after-hours transactions are loans between banks. Other times they are a means to give the appearance of having more money than the bank actually has, or less money, depending upon the need. Transactions that get recorded in the second book are known as either green screen or black screen transactions. Gray screen or black screen transactions. We already talked about green, so we have green, gray, and black. When it comes to the transactions involving the Black Eagle Trust and what it eventually became, they are almost certainly black screen transactions. All right, it's time for a quick commercial break. My name is Peter Klein. This is Fix the Media, an independent media solidarity production. You can download this show and all past shows or subscribe to our podcast feed by visiting fixthemedia.com. Thanks to Ed Opperman and the Awake Radio Network, Joe at On Air Radio Network, and Ryan at FPRN for broadcasting this show on our new time slot, Saturday night at 8. Stay tuned if you want to understand 9/11 at a deeper level than probably 97% of researchers out there.
We're back. Capacity crowd of over 80,000 dogs and cats here at the Lucy Bowl, where the canines are looking to break their tie with the felines. 1st and 10 on the 50. There's the snap. Jack back to pass. Cooper's going deep. Tight coverage from Ricky. This one's headed for the end zone.
Over 80,000 dogs and cats are euthanized every week. You can help stop this. Go to LucyPetFoundation.org today and donate.
Is the FCC necessary?
Self-appointed arbiters of the public good.
We are the products of the media marketplace. We are sold like slaves to the likes of CBS and the New York Times. And they're not going to let their investment go to waste.
You can hide it with FCC guidelines, which aren't safety standards.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Fix the Media, an independent media solidarity production with your host, Peter Klein.
Join us every Thursday at 10 p.m. on the Awake Radio Network. Welcome back, America. You're listening to Fix the Media, the show by IMS, Independent Media Solidarity, that will soon enough be the one that the world turns to for news of the free press returning to the people. I am your humble host, Peter Klein. If you wish to catch the show live, tune in Saturdays at 8. Otherwise, you can always go to fixthemedia.com and listen to any past show or download shows for your offline listening pleasure. And now, without further ado, Let's return to the New Perspective 9/11 analysis. Now I want to switch to the contents of a deposition that was taken of Earl Koch Jr. in his home city of Chevy Chase, Maryland in April of 2000. I'm just going to read some portions of the transcribed deposition, but as I do, bear in mind that this man died of cancer only 10 days following this deposition. I have no idea whether his death had anything to do with this deposition, but it sure wouldn't surprise me. I am president of Koch and Phillips with 2 L's. All right, and can you tell us briefly what your duties are in that occupation? I am Chief Executive Officer and have been since 1962. Could you give me a brief resume of your background and your education, training, and experience, beginning with your educational background? Graduate of the University of Georgia with an AB. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School and a number of honorary degrees, making speeches. I am in Who's Who in America for the last 48 years. All right. Do you have a law degree? Actually, I have an LLB degree. But even when I was in law school, I was not interested in the judicial side of the law. I have always been a legislator, not a judicial type. So I have written thousands of pages of legislation both in Georgia, the UN, Geneva. I am recognized as an international lawyer, but I am not recognized as a member of the bar in the United States. I know you had an outstanding military career. Could you tell us briefly your background? I came on duty, active duty, as soon as I was eligible and 21 years old in 1942 and throughout the entire Second War. And I was called back for Korea and called back for Vietnam. I am a retired brigadier general of the Georgia National Guard. The retirement they were giving is a little different because anytime they want you, so they send for you anyway. So you go back to work when they send for you. So although my service was broken up a number of times, I did serve in all 3 wars. Actually, most of the decorations, medals, and so forth are all covered in the biographical information. Just for the purpose of briefly describing those in what appears to be your Who's Who entry, you were decorated with the Silver Star, Bronze Star and Cluster, Purple Heart with 3 clusters, Croix de Guerre, Chevalier, Legion of Honor in France, Medal of Honor from the Republic of the Philippines. Is that correct? That is correct. Star of Solidarity. I understand you were a commander in the Knight of Malta. Yes, I am a Grand Commander in the Knight of Malta, the first Protestant in about 1,200 years so honored. Were you connected with the American Legion? I am a former National Commander of the American Legion. I am the youngest National Commander. I am now the oldest National Commander, and the bookends have met. Also, I understand you received a diploma and medal Cruz Roja from the Red Cross. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. And Honorable Comrade of the Nationalist Chinese Air Force in 1951? Yes, that is correct. You were associated with the Masons? Yes, I am a Mason. I am a Shriner. And I believe you held a special position with the Masons. Well, semi-official might be a better word because I never was on the paid staff. I was just a member in the true sense of the voluntarism, professionally. Now, I'll stop there before skipping to another section. I think we can safely say that this guy is super connected, and just the kind of person you might imagine having his hands on the purse strings of a top-secret treasure. I just wanted to establish that based on what we've already heard about this guy before moving on. And now to continue. Did you not have an office in the World Bank at one time? Oh, yes, I spent 61 through 63 and 64 there. What was your position at the World Bank? I was alternate executive director by title, but a full-time employee. My boss came in one time in 4 years, so he had a title of, executive director. And you worked for more than one president aside from Eisenhower? Well, really, from Truman to date. At some stage of the game, I worked for all of them. I have to admit some of them were very minor chores and others were important. You have a background in finance and banking? Well, Do you want to go to family banking and bring that up? Yes. I had a great-grandfather that put a bank together in 1867, which was the only bank in Georgia. I had a grandfather that put one in about 1890. And then my father was a commercial banker in the truest sense. He was president of Fulton National Bank, which is now Bank of America, for years. And he later was the president of the American Bankers Association and then chairman of the FDIC. I'm getting the impression that your banking knowledge came not only from the family. I took all the normal banking courses. I understand banking. I can teach banking. You understand what I'm saying? At the college level. You may note that I have asked you whether or not you have had on occasion to work with some of the government intelligence agencies. I have never been paid for activity. Most of the time they followed me in the sense that the FBI stayed with me all the time I was in New York. When I was at the World Bank, I had a CIA man that moved his office across the street from me, and he came by at least weekly anyway. We had a lot of contacts, yes, but to say that I was an employee strictly, the intelligence level, the answer is no. Now, you know that we have talked endlessly about a project transaction called Project Hammer. Can you tell us in a general way what the overall objectives of Project Hammer were? Well, it was mainly to bring monies back to the United States from all types of activities, both legitimately and illegitimately. Not that they were in the smuggling business per se, but they were all in the arms business. They were all retracing dollars of one description or another that had accumulated all through the 40s and 50s, really. That would involve, it sounds to me, please correct me, I am naive about some of these things, it involved various agencies of the U.S. government? Yes, obviously, the CIA, the FBI, the national security agencies of all types, Pentagon and the Treasury, Federal Reserve. Nobody got out of the act. Everybody wanted to get in the act. Since you mentioned Citibank, when do you think Citibank got into the act roughly? I don't know when they actually got in. To my knowledge, I am pretty sure they were in about 1988 anyway, in a big way. And what were they supposed to do? What was the function they had? They were going to be the trustees. They were going to be running the program. They were going to be the dispersing agency. They were the cheese. Was it Citibank's function and direction to gather the funds and then put them into certain kinds of programs to enhance their value? That is correct. In terms of ultimately dispersing the funds, do you know whether or not that has ever occurred? To the best of my knowledge, none of the principal has ever been hardly touched. I do think that on succeeding years, under great pressure, we are not going to pay you any of the principal, but we will pay you interest that you made on this corner, or you made on this deal. But those were small amounts. Okay, so those were just a few brief excerpts from a 40-some-odd page deposition. So there was lots of other material. But just what I narrated there contains a few golden nuggets of information. The key thing to remember is that this guy is admittedly connected to these affairs from the very beginning. The most relevant information is what he says about Citibank. It was also interesting to hear his perspective that everybody wanted to get in on this project, as he calls it. The questioner also refers to it as Project Hammer, but that's just another term used to describe the overall securitization of this illegal stash of gold. So Citibank, he says, was the central player from at least his perspective and involvement. Another way to view this is to assume that it's very possible that the CIA has been funding their black activities with proceeds derived from this gold stash for their entire existence, even as far back as their transition from the former OSS. Now let's jump into the meat of the theory, central to this very different perspective. You recall that I spoke of the pattern. Well, what was the pattern? In a nutshell, were we to have known of the numerous investigations ongoing into financial crimes back on September 11th, 2001, we might have detected this pattern right away. Because the ominous and unavoidable loose ends that might have revealed to the world these serious crimes going back decades were the specific targets of the 9/11 attacks. Let's begin with the Pentagon. Although I'm not going to go into this person in depth because of our limited time, there was a man who was being held in a Canadian prison before 9/11 that weeks before leaked documents that detailed very suspicious banking transactions involving the U.S. government. But other people have also leaked additional documents of a similar nature that amount to hundreds of pages detailing these suspicious transactions. They were in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars. Just as an example of why these transactions are suspicious, they were mostly made during a time of great federal budgetary constraint. Also, many of the transactions were into trust funds like those held by Pilgrim Investments to the account of one Jorge Bush. Now, why the testimony and information provided by this man's, whose name is Derek Vreeland, is so interesting is that he actually warned weeks before 9/11 his prison administration of the attack on the Pentagon before it happened. He also said at that time that he was an employee of the Naval Office of Investigation. It has been revealed by numerous sources, both before and after 9/11, that the ONI, or Navy Office of Investigation, was investigating certain securities being managed by specific securities brokers. In fact, a few separate sources cite ONI personnel as being the source for many of the leaked documents detailing what were essentially illegal transactions. Some investigators and researchers have described it as akin to transferring huge amounts from a federal treasury into your personal checking account. It was just a matter of knowing who those accounts belonged to. Jorge Bush, for instance. The northern-facing segment of the Pentagon has housed the big brass of both the Armed Forces and the Defense Department for decades, and this is public knowledge. The western-facing segment had been evacuated and under construction for 2 years just prior to 9/11. Only a month prior to the events, the Naval Command Center moved into the newly renovated segment, which included the ONI. It was the western segment that was attacked on 9/11, and although I can't find it in my notes to cite the exact number, I recall that all but one employee of the ONI had died in the attack on the Pentagon. So, to be clear, from my perspective, and one you might slowly be starting to adopt as well, the destruction at the Pentagon was deliberately caused to halt the investigations into specific securities. While we're on the topic of the Pentagon, I'll add that it's my opinion that Flight 175 did not crash into the Pentagon, nor did any other commercial jetliner. What most likely did crash into the wall of the Pentagon was a slow-flying Global Hawk that fired a missile enhanced with an enriched uranium tip right before impact, causing the clean punch-through of the interior rings. And that occurred at approximately 9:36 or 9:37. But the first attack to the western-facing segment of the Pentagon was actually minutes earlier at roughly 9:32. The official story has it that there was a single attack, totally ignoring evidence to the contrary. There are actually a few ways we can tell that an explosive event occurred before the Global Hawk made impact. First, there was the witness in a nearby building who gave testimony that he heard the explosion while attending a meeting and looked down to his watch to note the time was 9:32. Then, because the explosion knocked out the power to a large section of the building, all of the electricity-powered clocks in that section were stopped at the time of the explosion, 9:32. Numerous photos of these clocks exist as evidence of this. All stopped at 9:32. Not to mention the testimony of April Gallup, who says she also noted the time was just after 9:32. You may recall that Donald Rumsfeld gave a press conference from the Pentagon just a day earlier in which he described there being $2.3 trillion missing from the Defense Department's coffers. In my opinion, this report was connected to 9/11 in at least two possible ways. First, it may have been a sign of foreknowledge of the attacks, since under any other circumstances, that report would have sparked a backlash and may even have grown into a significant scandal. In addition, there very well may have been a massive accounting conundrum, partly or fully related to these financial shenanigans that I've been describing. Yet, again, reporting this on the day just before 9/11 ensured that it would disappear down the memory hole. So, we've addressed one of the possibly specific targets of the attacks. Now, we can examine the planes that appeared to have struck the twin World Trade Center towers. But before we do that, let's back up just a bit to the year 1991 for a moment. We've discussed the Golden Lily treasure becoming the foundation for the Black Eagle Trust, and then that evolving into Project Hammer. But that process didn't stop there. In fact, it continued unabated and actually expanded to include the funding of very unique projects. And one of those unique projects is exactly where we're now going to turn in our analysis. Various papers written that contain essentially the same explanation of the 9/11 attacks as a cover-up crime tend to refer to President George H.W. Bush and his accomplices as wanting to end the Cold War back in 1991. I suggest that, at best, they may have wanted to end the economic Cold War, but that there's nothing that suggests to me they cared one iota about the greater Cold War. But regardless of the underlying motivations to do so, we agree on what likely transpired. From all available evidence, most of which is or has become publicly available, it appears that the U.S. government was involved in a project to collapse the Soviet ruble and covertly buy up the industry of the Soviet Union. Whether their true intent was ultimately to bring the Soviet Union to an end and usher in glasnost and democratization, I can't say. But largely as a result of this project, that's what happened. Again, we see a major historical event in which the very trigger for the event is simply missing from the historical account. But if we view 9/11 from this new perspective of it as a cover-up, we can see how they chose to undertake the financing of this project was likely their biggest mistake and the largest contributing factor leading to 9/11. In September of 1991, George H.W. Bush, Alan Greenspan, and others facilitated the issuance of $240 billion in covert securities. These funds were spent on various sub-projects that, together, pillaged and destroyed the Soviet economy. Even the well-known currency speculator George Soros was involved in the plot, although his involvement was largely in destroying the value of the ruble. Other parts of the plot involved buying up various segments of the Soviet economy, mostly in areas like management of oil and gas reserves. So, can you guess when these covert securities were to have matured and come due for settlement and clearing? You got it, September 12th, 2001. Can you see how from this we can begin to dismiss so many claims of predictive programming or subliminal symbolism made about 9/11? In fact, the very date 9/11 is only relevant from this new perspective in that it happens to be the day before these securities were to have come due. Were the perpetrators to have planned the events years in advance, wouldn't they have chosen a much earlier date just to be safe, or simply settled on 9/12 since that was the due date? In any case, 9/11 became the target date for the event, and we've only since begun to refer to the events that day as 9/11 for short. Now, we've already skipped a huge volume of evidence detailing various related events and connected persons that come into the story during the decades between post-World War II and this project in 1991. For the sake of time, we're also going to skip many other pieces of evidence that support this new perspective that come into play during the 10 years following September 1991. For instance, other countries were hip to the U.S. using covert funds to engage in various criminal activities, many of which were beginning to be deemed criminal in foreign courts where it may have mattered. This pressure was being applied from Britain, Russia, Switzerland, and elsewhere, and the DOJ was beginning to feel the heat. Banks especially were feeling the heat as they were getting pressured in every case. They were getting pressured to reveal information about the accounts being used to fund criminal activities. Certain banks, the Treasury, and even Alan Greenspan, were being sued for gold price fixing and illegal gold sales, while Swiss banks were being pressured to allow its gold bullion records to be scrutinized, which would have revealed the extent of U.S. government criminality, possibly going back decades. Worse, though, the chance that the living perpetrators of outright theft of most of the world's gold might be exposed for their crimes was becoming a very likely possibility. Something had to be done. And now we come to the Twin Towers, or the next two of the 4 attack points. Do you know which company suffered the highest number of employee fatalities on 9/11? It was Cantor Fitzgerald. 660 of their employees are said to have died in the North Tower. Flight 11 appears to strike just 1 floor beneath the floors occupied by Cantor. Analysis of the damage to the Twin Towers suggests that the most immediate and severe damage was caused to the floors immediately above the impact points. The South Tower then appeared to be struck by Flight 175. Where it struck was the floor directly beneath the offices of Euro brokers. What's significant is that, in total, 41% of fatalities in the Twin Towers were employees of Cantor Fitzgerald and Euro brokers. What makes these companies significant relative to this analysis is they are the 2 largest government securities brokers by far, Cantor Fitzgerald likely managing 80% of all government securities at the time. The securities that were coming due on September 12th were government securities. Between the first apparent plane impact in the North Tower and the second in the South Tower, a series of explosions was reported to have occurred on the 23rd floor of the North Tower beneath the FBI offices. This led to what some reported as being an inferno and collapse of the floors separating the 22nd through the 25th floor. Gabon Intercapital was located on the 25th floor of the North Tower and happened to be another significant securities broker. So, if we can assume for the sake of this analysis that something actually struck both of the Twin Towers or otherwise damage was caused at very specific points in both buildings, isn't it likely that these points were deliberately selected? But what about Building 7, which was also fully destroyed that day very mysteriously? To begin with, relative to having potentially damaging evidence of state crimes like what we've discussed, the following entities had offices in Building 7. The Export-Import Bank, the U.S. Secret Service, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS, the CIA, and the Department of Defense. And for a sense of what the building's destruction had on one agency, here's a quote from a Secret Service special agent. All of the evidence that we stored at 7 World Trade in all our cases went down with the building. We lost our network, we lost all our computers, we lost all the equipment that we use as Secret Service agents. Everything from machine guns to our shotguns to our electronic equipment that we use. A lot of cases had to be closed as a result of losing that building. Now, very briefly, since we're running out the game clock here, we're going to cover another primary element of this unique perspective that 9/11 was a cover-up crime. Few people know that in the immediate aftermath, after 9/11, the SEC invoked for the first time in history its emergency powers under Security Exchange Act Section 12K2. They also lifted Rule 15C3-3, Customer Protection Reserves and Custody of Securities Regulations, which set trading rules for securities. We didn't spend time on the complex processes through which banks conduct business, but just know there are a crapload of them. My theory is that the banks partly implemented these practices over many, many years as a means to avoid being the victims of fraud themselves. But in so doing, they have attempted to allow tiny windows through which they can commit illegal acts at the same time. It's a precarious balancing act. But with the emergency rules put into play by the SEC, the Federal Reserve was able to conduct certain business in total secrecy. What they very likely did was substitute new government securities for the 1991 issued covert securities without having to show where either securities came from or went to. At the same time, the transactions were allowed anonymously, where no customers on either end of the trade was required to be identified. There's additional evidence of this sudden $240 billion in capital shrinkage and the Fed's technique of attempting to cover it up as well. Despite specific individual reports from all the relevant banks that their fail-safe systems had engaged without problem, the Fed insisted that they were experiencing settlement problems, or fails, where they essentially couldn't make certain payments by matching buy and sell orders. They claimed to have not enough takers of their new on-the-run 10-year notes, requiring them to reopen the issue on October 4th and hold a snap auction on their 10-year securities. Over the course of 2 months, the Fed is shown to have flooded liquidity into the market and then gradually reduced it so that the money supply returned to its pre-9/11 levels. Once again, understand that I've greatly oversimplified this aspect of the plot as well, in order to save time and not bombard you with boring details, the many boring details. But with that aspect now added to the equation, that just about covers the very primary components of the theory. Doesn't this, at least the little we've covered in this overview, make more sense than the standard theories of either pulling a false flag to justify going into Afghanistan and Iraq, or to justify a police state? From my analysis, external to this, it appears the government was going forward with action in the Middle East and ramping up the crackdown on civil rights without the need for 9/11. Which seems to me only more reason to agree that 9/11 was perpetrated for entirely different reasons. Now, I know that there are tons of niche areas of 9/11 research that we didn't even touch on, and I understand if you were hoping we'd get into some of them. The limited time just didn't allow for it. However, to wrap up, I'll add some interesting information and ideas that might shed some light on things or be worth pursuing. I support the work done by a couple researchers to assess the 9/11 planes footage in total, showing that the various videos do synchronize with each other. That was a big task and one that was very much needed. It supports the possibility of either planes or the physical image of planes actually being involved at the World Trade Center. Most that agree then tend to think a smaller object was possibly projecting a larger plane image. But they probably don't know about a material called SmackSonic. SmackSonic is a patented technology and combination of aluminum and layers of various viscoelastic polymers. The French company that makes it has a product that can be used in the fuselage and bulkheads of a jet as insulation that reduces its noise and vibration during flight. But someone realized that, without any modification, the material could be ignited with a certain band of electromagnetic energy or electricity and cause it to become an instantaneous plasma of 5,800 degrees. The fuselage of a plane insulated with SmackSonic would also rapidly become a plasma. So there's a remote possibility that this took place with both Flights 11 and 175, accounting for their apparent melting right into the Twin Towers and possibly even in Shanksville. However, personally, I suspect there was a plane flying over Shanksville that, for some reason, they lost remote control of and had to destroy with a couple sidewinders. My theory is that the major chunks did land in the vicinity, but we were simply never allowed to view them for fear that the lack of bodies and mid-air destruction wouldn't fit with the storyline. So instead, they found a natural ground feature that looked like a plane with wings, threw some junk metal and camp fuel into it, and burned it a little, claiming that the plane was swallowed by a hole that really wasn't even there. I guess if anything was learned, it was, if you push for an investigation of 9/11, you just might get a whiff of the anthrax. Okay, obviously we're going to need to do a part 2 of our 9/11 analysis. Just to fully consider the cover-up theory perspective would take a few more hours, but the show is nearing the end and I've crammed plenty into the hour we had. But the main thing to understand is that the media is corrupt and nothing short of a movement of the people can likely fix that. So kickstarting that movement is ultimately what Fix the Media is about, and despite that sounding crazy, we're going to do it. You're going to do it. Thanks for listening.